Good evening, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Rawhead Rex. Now, I don't have the physical copy of the movie on me at the moment because I had to return it to Movie Train Company from which I rented it. And the reason I checked it out was because it is a movie that's based on a short story by Clive Barker, who is one of my favorite horror writers. And Rawhead Rex, the story, was a very terrifying monster on the loose story. And this was a movie that, by most accounts, it's not a good movie. It's kind of a cult classic in terms of how cheesy it is, depending on who you talk to. But I've seen most of the movies that are based on Clive Barker's work, because he's the guy who gave us Hellraiser, Nightbreed, Lord of Illusions, and even though he didn't direct it, he wrote the story that the movie Candyman was based on. So he's got some pretty good credentials for the horror genre in terms of the cinematic universe, but more so for the literary realm because Clive Barker back in the 80s did a collection of short stories called the Books of Blood, which were considered very groundbreaking for the time in which it came out, because these stories tended to combine, extreme, gore, as well as, eroticism, but also they were very literate as well. They were written by someone who was clearly a lover of the horror genre, as well as, blood and gore, but the stories often had substance to them in the sense that, there were characters that, the readers could relate to, and, or at least themes that they could connect with. But the stories became, popular enough to where, a few studios, were interested in, maybe working with Clive, or in some cases, Clive, was interested in working with a few people to, bring some of these, short stories to life. And so that's how the movie Rawhead Rex came to be, because it was based on one of the short stories from the Books of Blood. And the movie was directed by a guy named George Pablo, and he's only directed, I think, 2 other movies along with Rawhead Rex. And this would be the second collaboration they did with Clive Barker, because prior to working on this movie together, they did a movie called Transmutations, although it was called Underworld in some areas. And I haven't seen the movie, but I heard it was kind of like a sci-fi crime drama, horror, but it was a movie that apparently it didn't do that well, and not a lot of people saw it. But that was the first time the two of them worked together. And so this time they're working, and it was an original screenplay, so it wasn't based on anything Clive Barker had done. But Rawhead Rex, it was based on one of his short stories. And Barker, he worked on the screenplay, and George Pablo directed. But I could have sworn I heard that someone else had maybe done some script doctoring at some point, but I could be mistaken on that. Anyway, though, so the basic story is, it takes place in Ireland, and there's this American family that's touring around the country because the father is wanting to do some research on various folklore, as well as religious symbolism, throughout history, particularly in rural areas. And also, it happens that his wife, she has some roots in this village that they're staying in. And anyway, though, while they're out and about, exploring the countryside, there's an excavation going on where there's this stone pillar that one of the residents of the area is trying to have removed from his property, and they've been trying to do it for a bit, but they decided, hey, let's just call it a day. We've spent so much time on this thing. But this one particular guy, whose property it is, he stubbornly tries to do it by himself, and through either dumb luck or nefarious forces, this stone pillar, it ends up collapsing, and out comes this monster, who is known as Rawhead, and the Rex, it's just kind of is added later on. But anyway, though, this monster, Rawhead, has been entombed, for centuries, hundreds of years, by the people who used to live in this, part of Ireland. And this monster is basically, a raging, pure evil killing machine. And, it, once it's awakened, it starts to go after, the townspeople, and causes all sorts of chaos. And the authorities, for the area, they end up underestimating the thing, and it also begins to corrupt some of the members of the clergy, as well as the authorities, because apparently it can hypnotize people, I guess. And the other thing is, it doesn't discriminate on who it kills, but at the same time, it does seem to have an aversion to pregnant women. And so the American author, whose family is on vacation in Ireland, they get involved because this monster actually goes after one of their kids and eats the kid. And so naturally, the family's distraught, and the father wants to get to the bottom of this, and his research actually comes in handy, because it turns out that some of the work he's done, like some of the photographs he's taken, they pinpoint clues in some of the murals in one of the town's churches that just might happen, to show exactly how this monster was defeated, all those years ago in the first place. And this, that's kind of the simplified version of it. Because I guess when you get right down to it, the movie is a straight up B movie that, has kind of the distinction of, being set in a rural area of Ireland. And, that, even though this wasn't that good of a movie, in my opinion, it, at the very least, it was unique in the sense that it was set in such a rural location. And so you have a little bit of a unique atmosphere given to it because of that, at the very least. So it makes it a little bit more memorable than it probably would be if it was, say, I don't know, set in, some, somewhere like, New York, like a lot of monster movies are. But anyway, it's kind of funny because the movie, in some ways, is actually pretty faithful to the story. Some of the things that the monster, that this Rawhead does, actually manages to make it into the screen, because some of the stuff that it does in the book is just straight up, if they tried to do that today, you're like, there's no way they'd get away with it. But some of the things that it does, like when it eats one of the people that it kills, is one of the main character's children. That right there, it's kind of whoa, they're really serious about this kind of moments, and basically it off screen, thankfully, but it eats the kid. And they're not so shy about showing the gruesome results of when it eats full grown adults or tears full grown adults apart. And granted, since it's a cheap B movie, I mean, yeah, there's some blood and gore, but at the same time, you can tell that, okay, it's definitely prosthetic. But the fact that they actually went with, the part in the book where a kid is devoured, that's not something you see in a lot of 80s movies. Usually little kids, I mean, there might be some, boo moments in terms of, say the killer or the monster going after a little kid, but 9 times out of 10, the kid's gonna be fine. But in this case, nope. So yeah, I mean, I gotta give it props for that as well. But at the same time, um, while it does get some points for the setting, as well as some of the actions that from the book that made it onto the movie. At the same time, you watch it, and then if you've read the story, and then you watch the movie, it's going to be a letdown because the story, aside from being a lot more explicit, there was a lot more of an emphasis on it being set, in the sort of a European setting, and if I remember correctly in the story, it was actually set just on the outer edges of London, I think. I mean, I could be mistaken. It's been a very long time since I've read the book, but either way, though, I mean, there was a very rural setting in both the story and the movie, but at the same time, I guess the creative decision to move it to Ireland, just kind of made it stand out just a little bit more. But even though it gets that little point for originality, I think one of the areas where it faltered was in the fact that the protagonist, or in the book, the one who is, I don't remember if he was an author in the book. I remember he was one of the main characters, but the guy who's he's with his family, they're going around to town, and one of their kids ends up getting eaten by Rawhead. I remember that I seem to remember that he was actually a natural born citizen of the UK. Like, he wasn't an American on tour with his family, whereas in the movie, he's a straight up American, with his family on tour. And I think right there, that's kind of where the movie lost some points, because it makes it seem like, okay, well, you just want to appeal to some American audiences. And so, we're going to randomly make the main character American, even though the whole setting is, in Ireland. And I mean, it might not be that much of a problem for other people, but for me at least, I mean, and also just bearing in mind that I read the story a while back, it kind of took me out of it just a little bit. I mean, I wasn't too invested because I knew what I was getting into, this being, just a B movie. But at the same time, I guess, when it comes to Clive Barker adaptations, I tend to, hope for just a little bit more. But anyway, though, I didn't think it was a terrible movie, but at the same time, I didn't think it was too good of a movie, because there were moments where, like when it came to, say, the horror, I mean, for one thing, the monster, the way they have him show up on screen in the movie, he kind of looks like something you'd see from, like a heavy metal band, or like say whenever like a heavy metal band has album artwork with some punk rock looking monster, that's kind of what Rawhead looks like in this movie. I mean, he looks like someone from, I think there was a band called Guar. I honestly had no desire to get into them just because of how freaky they were. But I mean, imagine like something of that scale, but on a much lower budget. That's kind of what Rawhead Rex looked like. Kind of, but at the same time, it, I guess considering what it was supposed to look like in the book, which was kind of, sorry to get explicit here, but sort of a, living, raging phallus is basically how Rawhead was described in the book. I mean, and also it basically lived to, kill, rape, destroy, and basically it was Clive Barker just went out of his way in the book to make Rawhead the embodiment of toxic masculinity, and he succeeded. But while he can be pretty brutal in the movie, he just comes across as a run-of-the-mill monster, partially because of how he, I guess maybe it was budgetary constraints, or maybe the people who were making the movie, if they read the story, they're like, there's no way we're going to be able to actually put that on screen. So they just went with, the heavy metal, reject monster. And so I guess, like, as far as, movie appearances go, I mean, you could tell that, it's not that elaborate of a costume, at least as far as, it doesn't have very much in the way of moving parts. But I mean, at the same time, I guess you could say it kind of works in the sense of, say, like, if you were to watch a Hammer horror film, I mean, it would have, blended just fine with those kind of horror movies. But since this was the 80s, the movie was made in 1986. They could have done, more with, I guess you could say, prosthetic limbs or something like that. That would have been pretty cool. But instead, it's just a guy in a suit, and and so I guess it kind of feels like you're watching a Hammer horror film that happens to be just a little more explicit than a Hammer horror film, in the sense that there's a little bit more in the way of blood and gore, and definitely more in the way of nudity, because there's a topless woman or two here and there. But you just don't really feel, I guess it's not as visceral, as anywhere near as visceral as it could have been. And in fact, in terms of, the horror, it's pretty tame. So, and another thing is that I think, as far as, comparing the movie to the book, there are certain things that happen in the book that, because Clive Barker was actually able to explain, say, thought processes, or, the actions in the short story, things tended to make a little more sense. But the way they translate to screen, it's like, I'm trying to think of how to describe it, but certain characters, just seem to randomly do things. Like, there's this one guy who is a member of the clergy, who ends up, becoming a worshiper of this monster. But the way they have him do it in the movie, it just kind of seems like, okay, this guy was already off his rocker, if his introductory scenes were any indication. But why in the name of Hades is he wanting to worship this thing? and so, while it's sort of a hoot to watch this guy, chew the scenery, if you're looking at it from, like, if you're trying to find, like, a serious motivation there, it just you can't really take it seriously. Whereas in the short story, it was straight up horrifying how, this guy was willingly worshiping this monster. And I guess maybe that was kind of an advantage of, the short story versus, the film, in the sense that, Clive Barker was able to elaborate more on, why this guy fell so quickly to this demon. And yeah, so, and there was some other things too. Like, I mean, in the short story, I want to say this member of the clergy was, I want to say he was the only one that was actually willingly, a follower of Rawhead. Whereas, everyone else in the town was either trying to run away from him or trying to fight back against him. But in the movie, though, it seems the monster seems to have some sort of vague hypnotic ability with some people, because there's another character who only in the movie, though, falls under his sway, and basically turns what might have been a stand and fight situation with the townspeople against Rawhead into a full on pyrotechnic massacre. And he's literally like saying for you," and I don't really understand how that happened. I mean, you just see the monster's eyes glow red at one point earlier when this character and the monster confront one another, but then then next thing you know, several scenes later, this guy's sabotaging the town's resistance effort against this monster, and you're kind of like, but why? So and also, like I said, just I'm a little spoiled on the short story, and that, I mean, there was something like that happened. Like there was sort of a pyrotechnic sabotage, but it wasn't just some townsperson just randomly falling under Rawhead's sway. It was Rawhead himself learning how to use fire, and how to blow up cars, which causes a lot of damage to the townspeople. So basically, it was another point in the book showing just how dangerous this creature was, in the sense that he had sort of this low level cunning, along with being the embodiment of toxic masculinity. But yeah, so that unfortunately that didn't make it to the screen, and it's just now it has some sort of vague hypnotic ability, I guess, with weak-minded individuals. But I mean, that opens up another whole can of worms. I'm going all into the rabbit hole here. But and another thing is just that I don't know, maybe it was because it was made in the 80s. When the main character, I think his name was the actor playing him. I think his name was David Dukes. Anyway, the character he plays, I mean, the American author, when he stumbles upon the method of defeat against Rawhead, I mean, well, technically it's still the same way, the same method of defeat that was used in the short story, but this being the 80s, though, they of course have to throw in a lot of pyrotechnic lighting effects, like phantasm looking figures, and bright lights and things like that. Whereas in the novel, that, I mean, there was a moment where this was this method of fighting back against the monster was used, but none of that pyrotechnic stuff happened. This was just in the movie because it was an 80s movie, and they're like, hey, we have to throw in some pyrotechnic and magical effects. And so if you're watching the movie without having read the novel, I mean, you're just going to be kind of like, what what's going on here? But if you read the short story, I think I accidentally called it a novel at one point, but if you read the short story, though, it makes a little more sense, but it is a letdown in a sense of how this method of fighting Rawhead, or at least stopping him, it was a lot more psychological, because it involves a symbol of a pregnant woman, and that is the one thing that Rawhead fears, because while Rawhead is basically the embodiment of toxic masculinity and kill, rape, kill, a pregnant woman symbolizes everything that he's against. Wow, lightning and thunder. And so yeah, it's raining where I am right now, and car alarms are going off. But anyway, though, so both in the book and both in the story and the movie, Rawhead's one psychological weakness is, a pregnant woman, because a pregnant woman symbolizes, life, birth, everything that he's against. And so in the story, it was a lot more psychological when it came to that moment, but in the movie, of course, it's a lot more, lights, spectacle, and what have you. So, either way, if you watch the movie without having read the story, it's just going to be very random and like, this is some bad stuff here, or if you read the short story, then watch the movie, it's going to be a total letdown because the psychological impact at the moment's kind of going to be diluted. But yeah, so anyway though, this isn't the worst movie I've seen, and it was okay in some respects, and I guess you could say it was kind of cheesy fun in the sense that it kind of harkens back to old school Hammer horror films, but unfortunately, because it was made in the 80s, it's like you're watching a Hammer horror film, but with people who act like they're in a Friday the 13th movie. I mean like the other characters, like some of the town's, late teens, early 20s. Sorry about that. I had to check something on the phone here. Anyway, though, late teens, early 20s, some of the other townspeople, they really act like they're in a slasher film, and so once they get killed off, you're like, okay, Hammer horror film that happens to be a slasher movie, and it's so basically it's a movie that is based on a story that is way scarier than what the movie turned out to be, and the movie turns out to be something that's at best dumb, cheesy fun, but even then though, it's not really something that, at least in my opinion, warrants rewatching, just partially because of my interest in Clive Barker literature. I watched some of the special features on the DVD, and learned some interesting stuff about the making of the movie. Like the actor who played Rawhead, that's literally the only movie he's been in. But he and he was speaking German in this retrospective, and he was reminiscing, and he's telling some funny stories about what it was like having to move around in that, and how he's having to get into shape to get into costumes. The guy was like 6'11", so but anyway, no, so just little things like that. So the DVD had some good special features, and I watched a good portion of them just because like I said, I was interested in stuff pertaining to Clive Barker, and so I guess in that respect, I'm glad I finally got to see the movie. And if you're a fan of, say, Clive Barker, and you're wanting to see, some of the movies that have been based on his work, it's worth checking out, but it's definitely not what you'd call a good movie. And it's, I guess you could kind of say it's more in the realm of so bad it's good, or it's just okay. Like, you're not really gonna think twice about it after having seen it. And so I think it was worth a rental at least, but I'm not losing any sleep by returning it as soon as I finished it. And so I'm going to go ahead and give Rawhead Rex 2 out of 5 stars. It was okay. Like I said, I've seen worse movies, but yeah, that's really all I gotta say about it. Didn't really make it much of an impression, and yeah. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. Y'all got any questions, comments? Drop a line. Let me know. Y'all have a good night. Be careful out there. It is pouring cats and dogs.